Autumn, 1896. Moscow glows in the fading light of the 19th century, a city balancing between the old world and the promise of the modern age. Among its restless minds is a young professor of law, a man of 30, thoughtful, restrained, and yet burning with a quiet unease. His name is Wassily Kandinsky, and his life is about to break open. That evening he takes his seat in the opera house. The work on stage is Wagner's Lohengrin, his first encounter with the German composer's music. As the orchestra swells, something astonishing happens inside him. He begins to see the sounds. Notes unravel into color. Trumpets burst into gold. Violins shimmer in blue, and the deep voices of the chorus roll through him like waves of crimson light. The curtain falls, but Kandinsky cannot move. He has just witnessed the invisible made visible. That night, the world he knew, the world of law, of rules, of logic, cracks apart. If sound could turn into light, if music could become color, then perhaps painting could become something more than imitation. Perhaps it could sing. For years, Kandinsky had carried a private hunger for art. He would later write that painting had been his first love, a love he had long suppressed beneath the duties of academia. But after Lohengrin, he no longer could. Within months, he made a decision that stunned everyone around him. He would leave his secure post, his career, his homeland, and become an artist. The idea seemed absurd. He had no formal training, no studio, no teachers. What he had was a vision, to create a form of art that spoke not to the eyes alone, but directly to the soul, an art that resonated like music. He wanted paintings that could tremble inside the viewer, that could set the spirit vibrating. Kandinsky's story began far from the world's art capitals. He was born in Moscow and raised between there and Odessa, a city of sunlight and salt air on the Black Sea. In Odessa, he attended school, but his true education came from the rhythm of the streets, the blend of Russian, Ukrainian, and Mediterranean influences, the music drifting from open windows, the glow of icons and textiles. His father took him often to concerts and exhibitions, to operas that seemed to lift him out of time. At home, music was constant. He studied piano, cello, and harmony. The family was cultured, liberal, filled with scholars and thinkers, psychologists, lawyers, politicians, people who debated ideas as naturally as they breathed. From them, he inherited not only intellect, but curiosity, and a belief that art and spirit were inseparable. Like many of his class, he entered university to study law. He excelled, disciplined, articulate, full of reason, but something in him resisted the confines of the courtroom. He found himself drawn instead to anthropology, to the study of human rituals and beliefs, the places where logic meets mystery. In 1889, he joined a scientific expedition to the Vologda region in northern Russia to study the customs of the Komi people, an ancient Finno-Ugric tribe. He observed their ceremonies, their songs, their vivid costumes, colors woven into rhythm, rhythm into faith. And in his notebooks, beside the legal observations, he filled the margins with drawings. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that his gaze was not that of a scholar, but of an artist. The expedition awakened him. He saw that every culture expressed its inner life through pattern, color, and sound, through what could not be measured. This understanding would stay with him forever. The hours I gave to science lost their meaning, he would later write, after my first encounter with art. Only art can lift me out of space and time. By the mid-1890s, Kandinsky's future seemed secure. He was married, respected, and on the verge of a professorship. But after Wagner, all of it, the lectures, the students, the titles, felt lifeless. He turned away, following the pull of something far less certain: art. He chose Munich, one of Europe's most vibrant artistic centers, filled with painters, musicians, and dreamers. There, among strangers and far younger students, the 30-year-old law professor became once again a pupil. He knew no technique, no craft, only that he must learn to give shape to what he had seen in that opera hall. In 1900, after years of disciplined study, he was accepted into the master class of Franz von Stuck, a celebrated painter known for his mythic imagery. Yet even there, Kandinsky felt trapped. He was reborn, yes, but shackled by tradition. The Academy worshipped precision, anatomy, shadow, and line. He longed for color, for emotion, for sound. He would later mock those early classes, recalling rows of students copying lifeless models without a single thought of art. Color, to him, was the key. It was not decoration, but language. Not surface, but vibration. Where others saw pigments, he felt tones, harmonies, dissonances. He painted not what he saw, but what he heard within himself. After a year, he left the academy and founded his own school of painting in Munich, the Phalanx. It was a bold, almost reckless move. 2 months earlier, the same institution had told him he lacked talent. Now he was teaching others. But that was Kandinsky, confident, analytical, driven by purpose. He understood how the art world worked, its hierarchies, its critics, its exhibitions, and he intended to reshape them from within. The Phalanx School was radical for its time. It welcomed women, encouraged open discussion, and sent students into nature to paint directly from the world around them: the Bavarian lakes, the forests, the open sky. It was there, among light and water, that Kandinsky began to explore Impressionism, trying to translate the rhythm of sound into color and form. The painter, he said, must work as the composer does, not to reproduce, but to evoke. His goal was to create art that could speak to the soul as music does, art that could move through the viewer like a melody, unseen yet unforgettable. By the turn of the century, Munich pulsed with the rhythm of innovation. Painters debated in cafes, composers broke the rules of harmony, poets wrote of dreams and spirits. Kandinsky stood at the edge of it all, older than most of his peers, but restless, searching. He had tasted freedom, but the methods he had learned still bound him to the visible world. Figures, landscapes, familiar objects, all of it began to feel like a cage. What he wanted was to paint what could not be seen. He wrote later, "The artist must be the hand that, through the proper touch of the brush, brings the human soul to vibration." It was a philosophy that would soon become a revolution. Kandinsky's early works from this period shimmered with mystery: dark tones lit by bursts of color, echoes of Russian folklore and medieval legend. In one, a saint baptizes the people of an ancient city. In another, horsemen gallop across deep, glowing skies. He was still telling stories, but something in those stories was beginning to dissolve. The outlines blurred. The colors began to live on their own. He was fascinated by the idea that color could exist independently of form, that a streak of blue could carry as much emotion as a human gesture. He compared his paintings to musical compositions. Each color, he said, possesses a sound, a tone. Together they form a symphony. In his Munich studio, he painted scenes he called the Old Russia, filled with shimmering golds and reds, dreamlike churches with onion domes, and long-forgotten riders. Yet the real subject was no longer Russia. It was the rhythm of the soul itself. Kandinsky was beginning to see the world not as a jurist, nor even as a storyteller, but as a composer of light. But for all his conviction, recognition did not come easily. His exhibitions were met with confusion, even mockery. At one show, viewers spat on the paintings. The gallerist had to clean them every morning before reopening. Still, Kandinsky persisted. He organized exhibitions, wrote essays, and supported other avant-garde artists, among them a young Paul Klee and Alfred Kubin. He was no longer merely a painter, he was building an artistic movement. He argued that critics had no right to judge artists. They look briefly, pronounce their verdicts, and move on. But we give our lives for what they dismiss. It was the birth of a new kind of artistic authority, one that placed creation, not critique, at the center of culture. Yet, even as he gained visibility, Kandinsky struggled with doubt. His paintings were shown in Paris 3 years in a row, but each time they were overshadowed by the blazing colors of Matisse and Derain, the so-called fauves, the wild beasts of modern art. He won a Grand Prix in 1906, but the honor felt hollow. "I have become insignificant," he wrote in despair. "I do not wish to remain a corpse. Only music can awaken me." Music, abstract, pure, and free from imitation, became his salvation. It represented everything painting was not: invisible, temporal, unbound by reality. It could express emotion without describing it. And that realization would soon push him beyond the visible world altogether. Then, in 1908, Kandinsky met Gabriele Munter, a bold, independent painter who had traveled alone through the United States, rode a bicycle across Europe, and carried her camera everywhere. She was intelligent, rebellious, and unafraid of convention. They became partners, in art and in life. Though Kandinsky was still married, his connection with Munter grew into a lasting, creative bond. She photographed him constantly, documenting his working life and their travels, a treasure of images that would later become one of the most valuable records of his artistic evolution. Together, they explored the landscapes of southern Bavaria, especially the village of Murnau, whose vivid skies and mountain light transformed their work. Munter introduced him to reverse glass painting, a local folk technique where the artist paints details first, then fills in the background, working in layers that are later viewed from the opposite side of the glass. The process fascinated him. It forced simplicity, clarity, and bold color, everything he sought. He began to paint large, luminous shapes, blue riders, golden suns, red churches, stripped of detail but vibrating with feeling. Color became architecture. Line became movement. He was moving closer to the edge, where the visible fades into the spiritual. Around 1909, Kandinsky began to feel the pull toward something entirely new. His paintings no longer depicted scenes, they evoked them. He sensed that color and form themselves could express what words and images could not. To him, painting was no longer about the external world. It was about the inner necessity of the artist. He wrote in his diary, "I must listen deeply to myself to measure the effect of color on my soul. If I succeed, I will create a new kind of painting, one that has not yet been seen, but one that the world will one day recognize." In one watercolor from this period, titled Composition 2, bright fragments of color seem to swirl without order, but within them lie hidden figures, a pair of riders, a mountain, a reclining body. The viewer must linger, searching, uncovering layer by layer, just as one listens to a symphony unfold over time. Painting, Kandinsky realized, could also be a temporal art, like music, something that revealed itself not in a single glance, but in a gradual rhythm of discovery. He was on the verge of abstraction, though the word itself did not yet exist. The decisive moment came one cold evening in January 1911. Kandinsky and Gabriele Munter attended a concert in Munich, music by a composer few had heard of, Arnold Schoenberg. As the performance began, the room seemed to unravel. There was no melody, no harmony, no structure the ear could follow. Notes collided and drifted apart, refusing to resolve. For most listeners, it was chaos. For Kandinsky, it was revelation. He felt himself lifted into another world, one without gravity, without center. It was as if sound had been freed from obedience to any rule, and in that freedom he recognized his own struggle. Schoenberg had broken with tonal music, just as Kandinsky was breaking with representation. That night he saw the future of art, and it was abstract. The next morning he began to draw feverishly, sketches of the concert, the audience, the black piano, and a surge of golden color that seemed to burst from it. He would later transform those drawings into a painting, a crowd engulfed by waves of light, the music itself taking form and wrapping around the listeners like a living force. The piece marked a turning point, the threshold between the seen and the unseen, the moment when music and painting became one. From that moment on, he would no longer paint things. He would paint sound. He wrote to Schoenberg a few days later, "I have just heard your concert and felt profound joy. Our efforts and our ways of feeling are so close that I am compelled to express my sympathy. You have achieved in music what I have long sought in painting, the road of dissonance." Schoenberg replied with equal warmth, "I thank you deeply." I believe we would have much to ask one another. Their correspondence would become one of the most remarkable dialogues in modern art, between the father of atonality and the father of abstraction. A few months later, Kandinsky completed a work that would quietly detonate the history of painting, an untitled watercolor, later known simply as his first abstract painting. It was unlike anything seen before, a composition of floating shapes, pure color, no reference to nature. He called it non-objective. No horizon, no gravity, no world, only vibration. He did not even list it in his catalogue. Perhaps even he sensed that it was too far ahead of its time. But from that moment, the line between music and painting was forever blurred. Together with the painter Franz Marc, Kandinsky founded a new artistic movement, a circle of artists, musicians, and writers who sought the spiritual dimension of art. They called it Der Blaue Reiter, the Blue Rider. The name came from a shared fascination with the symbol of the horse and rider. For Kandinsky, a messenger between worlds, a figure of transformation. Their vision was revolutionary. Art should not imitate reality, but express the inner resonance of existence. In 1912, they published the Blue Rider Almanac, a stunning manifesto of images and ideas. It brought together children's drawings, African masks, Japanese prints, medieval icons, modern music scores, and the works of Cézanne, Picasso, and Matisse. There was no hierarchy, no high or low art. Everything that carried spiritual energy belonged to the same continuum. It was the first truly global view of art, a vision that anticipated the modern age. But for Kandinsky, abstraction was never the goal. It was a bridge, a means to awaken the spirit. He believed every color had a voice, every form a tone. He spoke of painting as a kind of symphony, impressions, improvisations, compositions, each with its own rhythm and inner necessity. He described yellow as energetic and earthly, like the blare of a trumpet. Blue was deep and spiritual, the sound of a cello. Dark blue, the resonance of a double bass. Green, calm and balanced, like a violin. Red, the emotion of a tuba. Orange, the warmth of a contralto. Violet, the divine whisper of an oboe. For Kandinsky, colors did not merely fill space, they created it. To him, yellow advanced, blue receded. White was the beginning of all things, black their end. Painting was not about perspective, but about vibration, a spiritual geometry of light. And yet, this new freedom came at a cost. His works provoked outrage. Critics called him mad, a fraud, a barbarian. In Germany, newspapers mocked his paintings as contentless nonsense. But Kandinsky stood firm. He knew that what appeared empty was, in truth, full of emotion, full of sound, full of unseen order. He fought not only for his art, but for the right of art itself to exist beyond explanation. He poured these beliefs into a book concerning the spiritual in art, published the same year as the Blue Rider Almanac. It was both manifesto and map, a guide to a new kind of seeing. There he wrote, "Color is a means of exerting direct influence upon the soul. Color is the key. The eye is the hammer. The soul is the instrument of many strings." The summer of 1914 was warm and deceptively calm. Kandinsky and Gabriele Munter were vacationing in Switzerland when the news arrived. The First World War had begun. In a single day, borders hardened, nations turned inward, and the dream of a unified avant-garde Europe shattered. Because he was a Russian citizen living in Germany, Kandinsky was declared an enemy foreigner. He had 48 hours to leave the country. He fled first to Switzerland, then on to Moscow, alone. The separation from Munter marked the quiet end of one of the most creative partnerships of the early century. Back in Russia, he found a homeland transformed. The revolution was rising. The air was thick with ideology. To many, art now had to serve politics. It had to be useful. Kandinsky's talk of inner harmony and spiritual vibration sounded, to the new generation, like a relic of the past. At first, he withdrew, painting only what he saw from his window, quiet, figurative cityscapes, as if his imagination had frozen. But slowly he returned to color, line, rhythm, though the world around him was collapsing. Then, unexpectedly, he fell in love again, with Nina Andreevskaya, the daughter of a general, almost 30 years younger than he. He once said he fell in love first with her voice on the telephone. They married quickly, and soon after Nina became pregnant. But tragedy followed. During the civil war that ravaged Russia after the revolution, famine swept the country. Their only child, a little boy, died of hunger at the age of 2. Kandinsky never spoke of it publicly, but the loss remained a wound that never healed. Nina would reveal the story only 60 years later, near the end of her own life. By 1921, Kandinsky was weary, disillusioned by politics, suffocated by the materialism of the new Soviet culture. Then came an unexpected invitation. The Bauhaus, a progressive art school in Germany, wanted him to join its faculty. It was the chance he had been waiting for, a way out of Russia and a new beginning. He accepted immediately. He would never return to his homeland again. The Bauhaus was not just a school, it was an idea, a laboratory where art, design, architecture, and philosophy met. Founded in Weimar in 1919, it sought to unite all creative disciplines into one vision of the future. For Kandinsky, it was the embodiment of a dream he had once shared in the Blue Rider, the fusion of all the arts into a single universal language. He arrived in 1922 and soon became one of its leading teachers. He taught color theory, analytical drawing, and led the workshop for mural painting. He approached teaching as he approached painting, like composing a symphony, each element a tone within a larger harmony. His colleagues included Paul Klee, Lionel Feininger, and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, an orchestra of visionaries, each exploring a different register of modernity. At the Bauhaus, Kandinsky refined his art again. He moved toward geometric abstraction, circles, lines, squares, forms stripped of narrative but alive with energy. He sought a universal visual grammar that could speak across culture and language. In those years, his personal habits remained as precise as his compositions. Every afternoon at 5, he would stop working, pour himself tea with a thin slice of lemon, and listen to silence. Despite his formality, his students adored him. He was rigorous but kind, analytical but deeply human. The Bauhaus was alive with experiment, music, dance, theater, design. Kandinsky often collaborated with dancers, translating movement into visual rhythm. He designed sets and costumes of floating geometric shapes, triangles, circles, arcs, moving like music across the stage. He studied how motion itself could be painted, the push of a line, the drift of a curve. Even in static images, he sought rhythm. In his canvases from this period, accent in pink, dominant curve, multicolored resonance, color and geometry perform like instruments in a modern orchestra. Each line is a pulse, each circle a held note. But the harmony of the Bauhaus could not survive the politics of the time. To conservatives, it was too radical, too international, too free. The rise of the Nazi movement cast a long shadow. Its leaders condemned modern art as degenerate, un-German. Kandinsky's name appeared in their denunciations. In 1931, the Glass Palace in Munich, where many of his works had been shown, was burned in an arson attack. Hundreds of paintings were destroyed. Soon after, the Bauhaus was forced to close under political pressure. Kandinsky painted a haunting image that year. A wall of brown rectangles closing in, sealing the light, with one small opening still visible. A figure made of color, pushing back against the darkness. It was his quiet farewell to Germany. He and Nina packed their belongings and fled to France. Paris, 1933. The city still shimmered with art and intellect, but to Kandinsky it felt strangely distant, a place at once full of voices and yet profoundly silent. He and Nina settled in Neuilly-sur-Seine, a modest apartment overlooking the river. Here, surrounded by his canvases and the hum of the outside world, Kandinsky began what would be the final chapter of his life. The years of flight and loss had left him hollowed, but also purified. He no longer sought the roar of revolution. What he longed for now was harmony, a quiet inner music. He painted every day, even as Europe drifted once again toward the catastrophe. The France he entered was a refuge, but not a home. The art world that had once rejected him now regarded him with reverence, yet he withdrew deeper into his private universe. Friends would later say he seemed to live inside the colors themselves. His Paris studio became a world of floating forms, luminous, delicate, alive. The hard geometry of his Bauhaus years softened. The strict lines dissolved into organic curves, cellular shapes, drifting biomorphic figures. The scientist had given way to the dreamer once more. Kandinsky was fascinated by the new discoveries of biology and astronomy. He filled his notebooks with sketches of microscopic organisms, marine life, embryonic shapes, tiny living galaxies. In these fragile forms, he saw reflections of the cosmic order, a dance between chaos and creation. In paintings like Sky Blue and Composition 9, figures float weightlessly through space like creatures in a luminous ocean. They are part science, part spirit, alive with the quiet pulse of the universe itself. A friend once asked what these strange shapes were meant to be. Kandinsky smiled and said, "They are beings, just as we are. But they live in another world." Even as war returned to Europe, he refused despair. While bombs fell on Paris, he continued to paint, describing his work as a silent affirmation of life. He told Nina that he no longer wished to make noise in art, only stillness. He dreamed not of revolution, but of peace. He wrote, "Every work of art comes into being as the cosmos itself was born, through cataclysms that end in harmony. Each line, each color is an instrument. Together they form a symphony. The artist is but one voice in a universal choir. These were not metaphors to him, they were truths." His final canvases feel less like paintings than like meditations. Forms floating in perfect balance, each whispering its own soft tone into the ether. On the morning of December 13th, 1944, Wassily Kandinsky sat by his window overlooking the Seine. Outside, the war still raged, but inside, his world was quiet. The river, the gray sky, a faint light glinting off his brushes. He suffered a stroke that day and never recovered. He was 78 years old. Nina kept his studio exactly as he had left it. The brushes, the paints, the unfinished work waiting for his return. In the decades that followed, Kandinsky's vision would transform how the world understood art. He had given painting a new language, one that did not imitate the world but created it anew, as music does. He had proved that color and form could be as expressive as melody and rhythm, that the unseen could be painted, that the soul could be made visible. He is remembered not only as a painter, but as a philosopher of sound and vision. A man who turned the silence of color into the music of the spirit.